Science is interesting, and if you don't agree, you can fuck off.
Welcome to the Darwin Digest, episode 50. This week we are discussing the Jews. This should be interesting.
Oy vey!
As you can hear, I'm joined, as per usual, by my co-host, Kathy Princess.
Hello, Goyam. Nice to see you here.
And that's a terrible Jew
I'm
voice.
not going to keep doing it, sorry.
And our and my other co-host, Lawrence Drake.
Hello.
All right. At least Lawrence is normal. I will jump right into it then. Kathy, you're going to start us off with the Jews of China and India.
Yes, so I will talk about the Jews of the Orient, just to kind of show our listeners that it's not only the Europeans that this particular tribe have been, cohabitating with over the centuries. So first of all, let's talk about the Chinese Jews. So these are called the Kaifeng Jews. They are members of a small Jewish community in the Henan province of China, who, according to Wikipedia, have assimilated into Chinese society while preserving some Jewish traditions and customs. I'm sure that is the case completely. So the history of this Jewish community is quite long. So most scholars will agree that the Jewish community has existed there in Kaifeng since the late 9th, or rather 10th century. So since the Northern Sung dynasty. The Kaifeng was the capital of the Northern Sung dynasty and was at the time a cosmopolitan, multicultural, mercantile city on a branch of the Silk Road. So, no surprises there why Jews would settle. And the origin of these Jews is probably from Persia or India. And the first synagogue was built there in 1163. So maybe a little bit about Kaifeng. So it is in central China, and the Jews there are around sort of 1,000 in all. So it's quite in the broad population mass of China. It's a tiny drop in the ocean. It's believed that the language of these Jews was New Persian, and they presumably were experts in the production of cotton fabrics, in dyeing, printing patterns on cotton, and things like that. This industry was at the time, in the kind of early second millennia, was developed in India, but in China it was at the time there was an acute silk shortage. Therefore, cotton fabrics it's a growing demand over there, and I guess that's where the Jews come in. As I mentioned, the first Kaifeng synagogue was constructed in 1163. It was restored in 1279 after being destroyed in a disastrous flood, and was rebuilt again by the efforts of Chao Ying-chen, who was a Mandarin of Jewish descent, in 1653, when the sacred scrolls were also restored. After that time, the community fell into rapid decay, most likely as a result of its complete isolation from other centers of Jewish life. So there didn't seem to be much of a flow of cultural exchange between these particular Jews and the rest of the diaspora. By the middle of the 19th century, the Jews of Kaifeng preserved only a rudimentary knowledge of Judaism, and only the ruins of the former synagogue were left. So that's quite interesting. So the first news concerning the presence of the Jews in China reached Europe when Matteo Ricci, the Italian Jesuit, informed his superior in Rome about the visit that the Kaifeng Jew Aitian of Kaifeng paid him in 1605. I informed Ricci in detail about the status of his community, which led Ricci to reach the conclusion that they were of Jewish descent. There's other important records, including 4 Chinese stone inscriptions dating from 1489, 1512, and 1663. There's rubbings preserved of Chinese inscriptions on wooden tablets in the Kaifeng synagogue. And there's a unique scroll of the Book of Esther with Chinese illuminations by 3 different artists. So there is a kind of a cultural and historical heritage there. Absolutely. So the community really dispersed like I mentioned, in the 19th century. There was hardly any kind of any cultural cohesion left, but the Taiping Rebellion really led to the dispersal of the community, who then kind of later returned to their place of origin, and there were Father Joseph Brooker, who was a Roman Catholic researcher in the early 20th century, indicate that there were only in the range of 10 or 12 Jewish families in Kaifeng in the late 16th to early 17th century. And the numbers were really tiny. There doesn't seem to be any kind of growth at all to that population. I mean, obviously they did manage to preserve their traditions and customs for many centuries. But it was in the 17th century apparently that they really began assimilating in big numbers. There was a rate of increase in the rate of intermarriage between Jews and the Han Chinese, as well as the Hui and Manchu minorities in China. So in 1868, it was actually reported that the liturgy consisted only of pieces from the Bible. So, and there was S.M. Perriman, a scholar in 1912, wrote that they bury the dead in coffins, but of a different shape than those of the Chinese are made, and do not attire the dead in the secular clothes as the Chinese do, but in linen. So only these kind of very specific, these very specific traditions really were left over. So in the current year, there's not much research on the Kaifeng Jews and Judaism in China because of the sort of Han, the communist imposed atheism of that's occurring. That's kind of what's the word I'm looking for? That's the status quo. That's the status quo in China at the moment. But there is, in 1980, there was the Sino-Judaic Institute was founded by an international group of scholars, I wonder of their ethnic origins, to further research in the history of Jewish communities in China, promote educational projects, and assist the extant Jews of Kaifeng. At the moment, the last census revealed about 400 official Jews in Kaifeng, so that's... And about 1,000 residents of the city have ties to Jewish ancestry, although only 40 to 50 people actually partake in Jewish activities. So they're basically intermarried enough to be indistinguishable in appearance. And there was, I think one of the other kind of main traditions that they keep is not eating pork or shellfish. And that's basically about it. So those were the Jews, the Kaifeng Jews of China. I think one of the most unsuccessful Jewish, communities in this. Interestingly enough. So, do you guys have any questions or comments about that before I move on to the Indian Jews?
Did you say there were 400 of them?
Yes. In the.
So not many then.
No.
I mean, given that the country is 1.3 billion.
Yeah, exactly. They really are a drop in the ocean.
Yeah.
No, it's just a bit of sort of interesting history. You're kind of right in that they just rocked up and then haven't really managed to, do anything really. They're just there.
Yeah. It's. I guess we could make jokes about like the Han, like as the Jews of Asia being able to resist the actual Jews in that sense.
Yeah, what's that? The old joke or the old meme, like the Jew fears the samurai. It's like, well, the Jew fears the Han.
I guess so. And I mean, it probably also didn't help that they were extremely isolated, and especially, after the trade with China kind of tapered off, with the kind of more insular policies of later Chinese emperors. The lifeblood, I guess, of the Jews was cut off in that sense. So,
Yeah. Also, the fact that the ruling elites in China, like the Han, are so ethnically, what's the word? Well, not homogenous. Like they actually are fairly like inward focused on maintaining their own power. Like they're not as egalitarian as Europeans, and that's kind of how they get in there.
yeah.
So they didn't really get an opportunity to. Like it's almost like this is a good idea.
Yeah. So, shall I talk about the Indian Jews then?
Please
Okay.
do.
Yeah.
So there's several different types of the Indian Jew, but I'm going to talk about the Cochin Jews, or also called the Malabar Jews, and they are the oldest group of Jews in India, and they claim their roots all the way to the time of King Solomon. So really OG Indian Jews. So they settled in the kingdom of Cochin. That's where the name comes from, which is now the part of the state of Kerala. And as early as in the 12th century, there is records made of the black Jews in southern India. Black as in, dark Dravidian Indian type of black, not African black. For example, the Jewish traveller Benjamin of Toledo writes in his itinerary, quote, "Throughout the island, including all the towns thereof, live several thousand Israelites. The inhabitants are all black, and the Jews also. The latter are good and benevolent. They know the law of Moses and the prophets, and to a small extent the Talmud and Halacha." So these Indian Jews were not, unlike the Chinese Jews, they were not cut off from the broader, Jewish diaspora. There was a lot more, relation, a lot more interconnection, a lot more back and forth between them and the Jews of Europe and North Africa and the Near East. So there was so the first Jews in South India were alleged to be sailors from King Solomon's time. So it's claimed that following the destruction of the first temple in the siege of Jerusalem in 587 BCE, some Jewish exiles came to India. And then after the destruction of the second temple in 70 AD, there are records found that show numerous Jew settlers arriving at Cranganore, which is an ancient port near Cochin. It's actually known as a substitute Jerusalem in India in that community as well. So there's also kind of an interconnection with early Christianity as well. So, for example, Saint Thomas is believed to have visited India while proselytizing, and it's possible that many of the Jews who became Christians at the time were absorbed into that kind of Indian Christian community as well. So that's kind of an interesting side note there. And yes, so they've always seemed to have like Jews tend to do. They've maintained their unique traditions and appearance. There's a picture of a black Jew of Cochin with a peyot, the little hair ringlets. So it's quite an interesting sight. So in the current year, they are still there. So there's in Cochin, there's the Paradisi synagogue, which is still an active place of worship. But apparently the Jewish community is quite small. Obviously, maybe not as small as in China, but there's they don't seem to be. They also kind of seem to number in the low thousands. They have kept a lot of their traditions, a lot more than the Chinese Jews definitely did. Like I mentioned, the travelers stated that they knew the law of Moses and the prophets, and they also actually knew the Talmud as well. And unsurprisingly, European Jews sent texts to the community to teach them about normative Judaism. For example, Maimonides, whom I think we all have heard of, wrote, "Only lately some well-to-do men came forward and purchased 3 copies of my code, which they distributed through messengers. Thus the horizon of these Jews has widened, and the religious life in all communities as far as India revived." So, yeah, there's the Indian Jews. They have a long tradition of singing devotional hymns, and they seem to be I mean, obviously they speak the local language, but they also have this have retained a knowledge of Hebrew and all that. So it's definitely a little more of a far more successful, I think, settlement compared to the Chinese Jews. So there's that. That's the Jews of India, or one of the branches of the Jews of India, anyway.
Well, it's not.
Go, Lawrence. Go, Lawrence.
Okay. Well, Indian Jews is not something I'd done much thinking about. It's certainly interesting, but it stands to reason that they would be there because there is sort of everything in India. Like, they were early adopters of Christianity. There's, it's majority Hindu, but you also have lots of Muslims. You've got Buddhism. I mean, it's really got everything. So I guess it stands to reason that there would be Judaism in India.
Yeah, there's some. Interestingly, also, the Sephardic Jews settled in India as well, in the same region after being expelled from Spain and Portugal. So that was one of the places they actually went to as well. So, and they were known as the White Jews, obviously, because they were sort of much paler. So that kind of was a fresh infusion of of the tradition in that area as well. But yeah, India is definitely like the real proverbial melting pot of every single sect and religion, and so it's absolutely not surprising they would be there.
Including stuff that people just make up off the top of their heads.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's kind of what you do, isn't it? Call yourself a guru, get a website, and 40-year-old white women will just send you money.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's that. I think people hopefully found that interesting. I'd never heard of any Jews in China before I started researching this topic. So, and I only knew very, very sort of briefly, and I hardly knew anything at all about the Indian Jews as well. Just the fact that I'd heard that they were there, but.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Just sort of like when we say like diaspora, we just sort of think Europe and then a little bit in the Middle East, and America obviously, but it really is everywhere. It's kind of it's interesting, and I hadn't really heard of them until you mentioned that you were doing them that you were doing that as a topic. I was like, okay, I guess that makes sense. They would be there, but although I think the most interesting thing about it all is just the lack of political power that the Chinese and the Indian Jews have compared to the ones in the West.
Well, I'd hazard a guess that they're not particularly smart.
Yeah, quite. There'd be a whole heap of factors going in there, but there's obviously a stereotype of what Jews tend to do, and
it's the tiny numbers as well, isn't it? We're talking about hundreds to low thousands of them at any one point in either of the two countries. So obviously you don't need many, but I think there does need to be a critical mass of some sort.
Yeah, that's also true.
Maybe about 6 million.
All right. Did you have any more thoughts, or shall we move on to?
Oh yeah.
Shall we move on to the next topic?
Yeah, let's go on, and then we can maybe discuss kind of everything at the end.
All right. So I'm doing the Khazar hypothesis, covering it. And obviously I'll be discussing a little bit of the competing hypothesis, the Rhineland hypothesis as well, just sort of compare and contrast. But, that's that. So I'm essentially just going to be reading from one study. I will include quite a few in the notes, but this one study actually goes through in quite a lot of detail. Anyway, so What are these hypotheses? If you've never heard of them before, these are essentially the two hypotheses about how Ashkenazi Jews came about, or how European Jews came about. The Rhineland hypothesis has generally actually been the favored explanation in academia, and in this scenario, Jews descended from the Israelite Canaanite tribes that left the Holy Land for Europe in around about the 7th century, following the Islamic conquest of Palestine. Then in the beginning of the 15th century, a group of approximately 50,000 of them left Germany, the Rhineland, for the east. They maintained high endogamy, like inbreeding essentially, and despite wars, persecution, diseases, plagues, economic hardships, slavery, everything, their population expanded rapidly to around about 8 million in the 20th century, which sounds a little bit implausible. A biology professor, he's an expert in genetic disorders, in particular Jews, Professor Harry Austria. He would disagree, and he says that when summarizing his work on the genetic history of Ashkenazi Jews, that quote, "We confirm the notion that the Ashkenazi, North African, and Sephardi Jews share substantial genetic ancestry and that they derive it from Middle Eastern and European populations, with no indication of a detectable Khazar contribution to their genetic origin." So obviously, that's what camp he is in. He's in the Rhineland camp. He did also say that the only possible explanation for the population boom, while so isolated and whilst under such high pressures, was that it was a, quote, miracle. But, his research is freely available as long as your research includes novelty and strength of proposal, non-overlap with current or planned activities, and is non-defamatory in nature towards the Jewish people. Did I mention that Professor Austria is Jewish and he teaches at Yeshiva University? This is one of the main leading academics, a proponent for the Rhineland hypothesis. And basically, when you look at citations, it's all a big pyramid citation to his work, and that you can't access the data because that would be anti-Semitic. So in short, the Rhineland hypothesis can be summed up as a few thousand Jews left the Middle East about 500 to 700 years after Christ died, headed towards Europe, were persecuted along the way by all the evil anti-Semites, were still persecuted, kicked out of everywhere, dealt with huge amounts of disease and famine, and because they're God's chosen people, everything turned out a-okay. Still managed to breed up to 8 million by the start of the 20th century. Doesn't seem very likely. That's the Rhineland hypothesis. The Khazar hypothesis is from the paper that I'll be reading from, actually does a decent explanation for it. The missing link of Jewish European ancestry, contrasting the Rhineland and Khazarian hypotheses. In Genome Biology and Evolution, 2013, and links will be in the description. The question of Jewish ancestry has been the subject of controversy for over 2 centuries, and has yet to be resolved. The Rhineland hypothesis depicts Eastern European Jews as a, quote, population isolate that emerged from a small group of German Jews who migrated eastward and expanded rapidly. Alternatively, the Khazarian hypothesis suggests that Eastern European Jews descended from the Khazars, an amalgamation of Turkic clans that settled the Caucasus in the early centuries Common Era and converted to Judaism in the 8th century. Mesopotamian and Greco-Roman Jews continuously reinforced the Judicized empire until the 13th century. Following the collapse of the empire, the Judo-Khazars fled to Eastern Europe. The rise of European Jewry is therefore explained by the contribution of the Judeo-Khazars. Thus far, however, the Khazars' contribution has been estimated only empirically, as the evidence of genome-wide data from Caucasus populations precluded testing the Khazarian hypothesis. Recent sequencing of modern Caucasian populations prompted us to revisit the Khazarian hypothesis and compare it with the Rhineland hypothesis. We applied a wide range of population genetic analyses to compare these two hypotheses. Our findings support the Khazarian hypothesis and portray the European Jewish genome as a mosaic of Near Eastern, Caucasus, European, and Semitic ancestries, thereby consolidating previous contradictory reports of Jewish ancestry. We further describe a major difference among Caucasus populations, explained by the early presence of Judeans in the southern and central Caucasus. Our results have important implications for the demographic forces that shaped genetic diversity in the Caucasus and medical studies. All right, so this is where we'll get a little bit more heavy as far as the sciencey stuff is concerned. To confirm the Rhineland and Khazarian hypothesis indeed portray distinct ancestries, we assessed the degree of background admixture between Caucasus and Semitic populations. We calculated the F3 statistics between Palestinian and 6 Caucasus and Eurasian populations using the African San as an outgroup. The F3 results of Turks, Armenians, and Georgians, Lekins, Adiyegi, and Russians indicated a minor but significant admixture between Palestinians and the populations tested. Because Armenians and Georgians diverged from Turks 600 generations ago, we can assume that the lion's share of their admixture derived from that ancestry and within the expected levels of background admixture typical to the region rather than recent admixture with Semitic populations. Therefore, similarities between European Jews and Caucasus populations will unlikely be due to shared Semitic ancestry. PCA was next used to identify independent dimensions that capture most of the information in the data. PCI was applied using 2 frameworks, the multi-population carried for all populations, separately for Eurasian populations along with Pygmies and Han Chinese. In our novel dual population framework, in all analyses, the studied samples aligned along the 2 well-established geographical axes of global genetic variation. PC1, Sub-Saharan Africa versus the rest of the world, and PC2, East versus West Eurasia. Our results reveal geographically refined groupings, such as the nearly symmetrical continuous European rim extending from Western to Eastern Europeans, the parallel Caucasus rim, and the Near Eastern populations, organized in Turk-Iranian and Druze clusters. Middle Eastern populations form a gradient along the diagonal line between the Beridins and Near Eastern populations that resemble their geographical distribution. The remaining Egyptians and the bulk of the Saudis distribute separately from Middle Eastern populations. European Jews are expected to cluster with native Eastern or Caucasus populations, according to the Rhineland or Khazarian hypotheses, respectively. The results of all PC analyses show that over 70% of European Jews and almost all Eastern European Jews cluster with the Georgian, Armenian, and Azerbaijani Jews within the Caucasus Rim. Approximately 15% of European Jews cluster with the Druze and the rest with the Cypriots. All European Jews cluster distinctly from the Middle Eastern cluster. Strong evidence for the Khazarian hypothesis is the clustering of European Jews with the populations that reside on the opposite ends of Khazaria, Armenians, Georgians, and Azerbaijani Jews. Because the Caucasus populations remained relatively isolated in the Caucasus region, and because there are no records of the Caucasus populations migrating to Eastern Europe and Central Europe prior to the fall of Khazaria, these findings imply a shared origin for European Jews and Caucasus populations. That was quite heavy, quite a lot of stuff. So essentially what they've done there is they've gotten all of this genetic data and they've separated it into 2 broad groups to sort of do this analysis. Middle Eastern and sort of Caucasus populations. And they've sort of gotten those 2 populations group, and you sort of worked out, what they've done then is compare the European Jews and just sort of worked out how closely the Jews align to either of those 2 population groups. Finding, of course, that the Caucasus populations are have far more in common with Eastern European Jews than the Middle Eastern, implying that the Khazarian hypothesis is correct. Okay, to continue. Although they cluster with Caucasus population, Eastern and Central European Jews share a large fraction of Western European and Middle Eastern ancestries, both absent in Caucasus populations, implying that there is, in fact, Middle Eastern stock. At the very base of it, This all comes together. According to the Khazarian hypothesis, the Western European ancestry was imported to Khazaria by Greco-Roman Jews, whereas the Middle Eastern ancestry alludes to the contribution of both early Israelite Proto-Judeans as well as Mesopotamian Jews. Central and Eastern European Jews differ mostly in their Middle Eastern, 30 and 25% respectively, and Eastern European ancestries, 3 and 12% respectively, probably due to late admixture. Druze exhibit large Turk-Iranian ancestry, 83%, in accordance with their Near Eastern origin. Jews and Cypriot appear similar to European Jews in their Middle Eastern and Western ancestries, though they differ largely in the proportions of the Caucasus ancestry. These results can explain the genetic similarity between European Jews, Southern Europeans, and the Druze reported in studies that excluded Caucasus populations. Overall, our results portray European Jewish genome as a mosaic of Near Eastern Caucasus Western European, Middle Eastern, and Eastern European ancestries in decreasing proportions. To glean further details of the genomic regions contributed to the genetic similarity between European Jews and their prospective populations, we compared the total genomic regions shared by IBD. If European Jews emerged from Caucasus populations, the two share longer IBD regions than the Middle Eastern populations. The IBD analysis exhibits a skewed bimodal distribution, embodying a major Caucasus ancestry with a minor Middle Eastern ancestry. Consistent with the admixture results, the total IBD regions shared between European Jews and Caucasus populations are significantly larger than the regions shared with Palestinians. To the best of our knowledge, these are the largest IBD regions ever reported in European Jews and non-Jewish populations. The decrease in total IBD between European Jews and other populations, combined with the increase in the distance from the Caucasus, supports the Khazarian hypothesis. All right, so what they're doing is they're just taking multiple different ways to sort of measure this, and it's all coming out the same every single time. I actually had already cut this down, but I'm going to cut it down even further until we get to something that's really funny. Here it is. Okay, finally, we carried uniparental analysis on the mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome, comparing the haplogroup frequencies between European Jews and other populations. The Rhineland hypothesis depicts Middle Eastern origins for European Jews, paternal and maternal ancestries both, whilst the Khazarian hypothesis depicts a Caucasus ancestry along Southern Europeans and Near Eastern contributions of migrants from Byzantium and the Caliphate respectively. Because Judaism was maternally inherited only since the 3rd century Common Era, the mitochondrial DNA is expected to show a stronger locally female biased founder effect compared with the Y chromosome. Haplogroup similarities between European Jews and other populations were plotted as heat maps, basically plotted on a map. Pairwise distances between all studied populations were shown on the link will be in the description. Our results shed light on sex-specific processes that, although not evident from the autosomal data, are analogous to those obtained from the biparental analysis. Both mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome analyses yield high similarities between European Jews and Caucasus populations rooted in the Caucasus, in support of the Khazarian hypothesis. Interestingly, the maternal analysis depicts specific Caucasus founding lineage with weak Southern European ancestry, whereas paternal ancestry reveals a dual Caucasus Southern European origin. As expected, the maternal ancestry exhibits a higher relatedness scale with narrow dispersal compared with the paternal ancestry. So what does that mean? We've discussed different mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome and how they can be used to detect direct maternal and paternal ancestry, and what you sort of see here is there's a so because of the restrictions on the restriction on the number of women in the founding group, because it was so small compared to the array of genomes in the Y chromosome. What's likely to have happened is, if you recall, Jews have a maternal Judaism is inherited maternally. If your mother is a Jew, you're a Jew. So quite a lot of Ashkenazi Jews are probably not technically Jews. is the long and skinny of it, which I find hilarious. So what sort of comes out here, I'll just rephrase it a bit, I guess. Because of the restriction on the number of women in the founding group, it's quite likely that a significant portion of Ashkenazi Jews are technically not Jews according to their own definition of Judaism, in that it's inherited from the mother.
Yeah, that's quite an interesting development, isn't it?
I just think it's really funny.
Yeah. I guess I always found this kind of matrilineal thing to be, not to be a real argument whether somebody is or isn't a Jew. I mean, come on. If your father's a Jew, you're...
Oh, I agree, 100%.
You're just as much of a Mischling as if your mother is, But yeah, it is kind of an ironic thing, I guess, in that sense.
Yeah, and the best part is because it was, it was so long ago. It wasn't that long ago, relative, as far as talking the length of the species, but it's long enough ago that we've got no way to measure it, so you just may not be one of the chosen ones. Which like I said, that's just really funny. So Okay, so Central and European Jews comprise the largest group of contemporary Jews, accounting for approximately 90% of over 13 million worldwide Jews. Eastern European Jews made up over 90% of European Jews before World War II. Despite the controversial ancestry, European Jews are an attractive group for genetic and medical studies due to their presumed genetic history. And that's actually a quote from that. That's the quote that begins the discussion. That's from Austria, the guy at the very start that I was talking about, who teaches at Yeshiva University. I didn't actually notice that until then. Correcting for population structure and using suitable controls are critical in medical studies. It's thus vital to determine whether European Jews are Semitic, Caucasus, or other ancestry. Essentially, that's just saying, we're discovering all of these differences in biology according to ancestry, and hey, you might just be treating them wrong. Like medically, you might just be treating them wrong if they're from the wrong, put them into the wrong origin group. But yeah, that's kind of, I guess I don't want to keep just going through all of this stuff because there's a lot of it. I guess I went a bit overboard with the amount of data. It's still going, by the way, with the amount of analysis in there. But I just sort of really want to emphasize how much stuff there actually is. So I'll just go right to the end. So a major difficulty with the Rhineland hypothesis, this is from the same paper, it's just summing everything up. A major difficulty with the Rhineland hypothesis, in addition to the lack of historical and anthropological evidence to the multi-migration waves from Palestine to Europe, is to explain the vast population expansion of European Jews from 50,000 15th century to 8 million in the 20th century. The annual growth rate that accounts for this population expansion is estimated to be at 1.7 to 2%. That's an order of magnitude, one order of magnitude higher than that of Eastern European non-Jews in the 15th to 17th centuries, prior to the Industrial Revolution. This growth could not possibly be the product of natural population expansion, particularly one subjected to severe economic restrictions, slavery, assimilation, the Black Death, and other plagues, forced and voluntary conversions, persecutions, kidnappings, rapes, exiles, wars, massacres, and pogroms. Because such an unnatural growth rate, over half a millennia and affecting only Jews residing in Eastern Europe, is implausible. It is explained by a miracle. Again, the citation for that is the same person from the very start, and another one. Whereas at Zimon, which looks kind of Jewy, I guess. Unfortunately, this divine intervention explanation poses a new kind of problem. It is not science. The question of how the Rhineland hypothesis, so deeply rooted in supernatural reasoning, became the dominant scientific narrative is debated among scholars. I wonder why this supernatural explanation could have been so popular. I just can't think of a possible reason. But yeah, that's my part. So do you guys have any thoughts on that? On the hypothesis in general, or competing with the Rhineland hypothesis, or?
Well, as far as I understand, the Khazar hypothesis is a fringe one amongst experts, so I'd be a little bit skeptical of it.
That's the thing, is it's not. Like I said, I've got a lot of sources here, and they're all from the last 10 years or so. When I was researching this, I was looking at, I did actually look at the Rhineland hypothesis. There are two papers which are basically the basis for it as far as academia is concerned. One was published in 1990, and the other was, I think it was early 2000s. And essentially what they do is they take the similarity between the Sephardic and the Ashkenazi Jews, and they just measure the genetic similarity. And because they're very similar genetically, then the Rhineland hypothesis must be correct, is essentially the argument. It has the problem in that both of those groups have their own sort of European population admixtures, and so all of the similarities from the European part gets conflated, but none of them actually. So the fact of the matter is, as far as genetic heritage is concerned, the vast majority of their genome comes from the Caucasus, as opposed to the Middle East.
Yeah, that's an interesting, because I was always under the impression as well that the Khazar hypothesis was kind of like the weirdo fringe idea.
So was I.
And I was never sure why people were so set against it, because there's plenty of historical evidence of the Khazars existing and them being, if not originating from the same place as the Israelites, of them, having converted to Judaism and then having wreaked havoc on that part of the world, with their slave trade and having finally been rightfully crushed. So, and they didn't just disappear. Their genetics didn't just go away. So, yeah, I'm a bit more, after what you've told us here. I think I'm a bit more convinced. I mean, I'm still not 100% convinced. I don't know. I think there might be, maybe there's more evidence. Maybe there's some truth in both of these, stories of origin. Maybe it's a bit of both in that sense. But yeah, I'm kind of it's very interesting to consider now that the Khazar hypothesis might have not been so far-fetched after all, and it just surprises me, the hostility that the establishment might have against it.
Yeah, like I mentioned at the start, the major proponent for the Rhineland hypothesis, who is Austria, Dr. Austria, his research data is not available. You cannot you can apply to get access to it, but if your research could possibly be interpreted as anti-Semitic, then it's just not available.
Oh, right. Lol. Okay. Yeah.
Okay, I'll go to that quote from the very start.
I remember. I remember now when you said it. Yeah, you should do it again. Yeah. It's just so funny.
Yeah. So his research is freely available, discussing access to his data. Quote, research includes novelty and strength of the proposal, non-overlap with current or planned activities, and non-defamatory nature towards the Jewish people. And then the other major issue that the Rhineland hypothesis has to try and account for is also that population boom that the final paragraph of that paper that I read out covers. It says, so to quote again. This is the paper, not the Jewish doctor. The annual growth rate that accounts for this population expansion was estimated at 1.7 to 2%. That's one order of magnitude higher than that of Eastern European non-Jews in the 15th at the same time, basically, prior to the Industrial Revolution. This growth could not possibly be the product of natural population expansion, particularly one subjected to severe economic restrictions, slavery, assimilation, the Black Death, other plagues, forced and voluntary conversions, persecutions, kidnappings, rapes, exiles, wars, massacres, and pogroms. It's just, even if the Khazar hypothesis is just 100% wrong, the Rhineland hypothesis is still not a good explanation.
Yeah, you could argue that a lot of those historical grievances may have been a tiny bit overplayed, as we all.
The Black Death wasn't.
I mean, yes, the Black Death wasn't. I'm talking about maybe the man-made ones. But
yeah, sure. Yeah. So we take out pogroms, wars, massacres, rapes, I guess, exiles, kidnappings, persecutions, forced and voluntary conversions, slavery. You take out pretty much all of them. Just leave the Black Death. Compare it to, the population expansion, non-Jews in the same period of time, and it's an order of magnitude larger.
Yeah.
That's still ridiculous.
It is ridiculous, and also keeping in mind that the Jews were a lot more urban and a lot more sort of closely packed than the rest of the Eastern European population. The effect of the Black Death would have been, heavier on them compared to anyone else, if anything. So yeah.
Yeah, that's also another good point. But yeah, it's just I when I went into this, I thought it would kind of be just to be clear, there are still those 50,000. There are still those 50,000 European Jews who were in Germany at the very start, and they moved east. That still happened, but the fact of the point is that there was this big wave of. In addition to that, there was a big population boom from somewhere. The Khazar hypothesis basically says it came from this particular region, and there's quite a good bit of research now to say that it was in fact from the Caucasus and from Khazaria.
So the Khazar milkers is a thing after all.
Are in fact true.
Excellent. Yes. I'm glad when memes come to life.
Yes. Well, so obviously the Rhineland hypothesis was true up until we started memeing about Khazar milkers.
Yeah, exactly. Praise Keck.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah. Anyway.
Anyway, did you have any thoughts on that, Lawrence?
Well, I'm still a little skeptical because, as I understand it, the past 20 years or so of genetic research into Jewish ancestry hasn't found any Khazar, sort of major Khazar contributions to their genome.
The paper I just went through outlined all of that, though.
Yeah, that's one paper, but most papers don't find that.
Although, like I said, there's not even, like I said, there were 2 big papers, and everything else is a pyramid citation to those 2 papers, as far as the Rhineland hypothesis is concerned. That's all right.
I think,
like I'm just like bringing this out now, so I don't expect you to be like.
And something that maybe we can discuss in a forthcoming episode with a very special guest, is the fact that Jewish citation strategies have a particular, tendency to them. They tend to cite each other, and they tend to cite papers that reflect whatever whatever narrative they want to push. So I think, especially if, as you say, so if it's 2 papers that actually did the work and then everybody else is just citing them, and then you can't actually see the data of those papers, it's a tiny bit suspicious.
Okay, well, many people that have written about it, like Nicholas Wade, was not convinced by it.
Yeah, and these papers have only been, this one was 2013, and there was another one was 2010. So, this is only new, and at the very start of this paper, it does mention that. Let me find it for you. Where is it? So. Thus far, however, the Khazar's contribution has only been estimated only empirically, as the absence of genome-wide data from the Caucasus population precluded testing the Khazarian hypothesis. Recent sequencing of modern Caucasus populations prompted us to revisit the Khazarian hypothesis and compare it with the Rhineland hypothesis. So it's the whole point of the study was that data did not actually exist, and only now have they actually been able to properly construct something. Anyway. I think we could probably argue about this all night. Shall we move on to your topic, Lawrence?
All right. Well, I'm covering Jewish intelligence. So I think, to start with, I'll just outline that there are the Ashkenazim, which are European-based Jews, and then you have Mizrahi, which are Jews from the Middle East, so that would be like Iraq, Egypt, Turkey, Iran, Syria. Most of them have migrated into Israel now. There's also the Sephardim that are from Portugal and Spain, and then they fled persecution and settled in Eastern Europe, in the Balkans, and then there's the populations that Kathy Princess described, and then there's one other that doesn't really fit into the other categories, and that's the Ethiopian Jews, and they don't seem to have any genetic similarity to the other Jewish population. So what they are is just people that converted more recently, and they're not actually genetically related, and they tend to have IQs about the same as the Ethiopian mean, which is about 68. So now that I've got my terms out of the way, in the early 19th century, that's when people started to note that Jews were a highly successful people. Because before that, they were discriminated against in most of Europe. For instance, they were not allowed to attend universities. They were not allowed to get medical and professional licenses, and most Jews actually spoke Yiddish and tended to keep to themselves. And they were emancipated first in France by Napoleon in the early 19th century, and emancipation followed in most of Europe after that. And they began to do well in trades like banking, finance, industry, science, and the professions. And at this time, most Jews, that is Ashkenazi Jews, were living in the Russian Empire and the region that's now Poland. And there were many pogroms, and many of them fled to Western Europe, and they arrived with no money or language skills, but their grandchildren ended up doing better than Gentiles on all indices of socioeconomic and academic success. And since then, Jews they've won about 27% of Turing Awards given for advancements in computer science, and they're about half of the world's chess grandmasters. They're also about half of the bridge champions. Bridge is a card game that's very intellectually demanding and complex. I don't really know much about it, but about half the bridge champions are Jews. From about 1901 to 1962, they were about 16% of Nobel Prize winners, which is an overestimation by a factor of, or an over-representation, I should say, by a factor of 6.6. If we took the 1938 Jewish population at 18 million and the European Gentile population at 718 million. So a lot of people noticed this success that they achieved since the 19th century. In 1847, Lord Ashley said in the House of Commons, "The Jews are a people of very powerful intellect. They presented, in proportion to their numbers, a far larger list of men of genius and learning than could be exhibited by any Gentile country. Music, poetry, medicine, astronomy occupied their attention, and in every field they were more than a match for their competitors." Count de Gobineau in France, I think it's French, wrote about it in 1853, and he concluded that Aryans and Jews are the two most intelligent people. Francis Galton, who was certainly someone who was very interested in genius and hereditaryism, wrote in his work Hereditary Genius that in 1869 that Jews were rich in families of high intellectual breeds. Mark Twain said that Jews' contribution to the world's list of great names in literature, science, art, music, finance, medicine, and abstruse learning is way out of proportion to the weakness in his numbers. And in the 20th century, people kept noticing this. Joseph Jacobs in 1919 said, "A determinate number of Jews at the present time will produce a larger number of geniuses, whether inventive or not, I will not say, than any equal number of men of other races. It seems highly probable, for example, that German Jews at the present moment are quantitatively, not necessarily qualitatively, at the head of European intellect." The Norwegian social scientist and economist Thorstein Veblen in 1919 said that Jewish success lies in their detachment from their host societies, which allows them to be freed from conventional thinkings and more imaginative, which he argued was required for scientific innovation. And he said, quote, "It is by the loss of allegiance that he finds himself in the vanguard of American inquiry. He becomes the disturber of the intellectual peace, but only at the cost of becoming an intellectual wayfaring man, a wanderer in the intellectual no man's land seeking another place to rest," end quote. And based on that, he concluded, and he was writing before the State of Israel was founded, that Jews would be less innovative if they got their own homeland. However, he didn't live to see what happened. There's been 6 Nobel Prizes awarded to Israelis, so that certainly didn't make them dumber to have their own homeland. With the advent of IQ testing, it was found that Jews scored higher than Gentiles. And studies started coming out in the 1920s confirming this. Nathaniel Weil and Stephen Possony published a landmark book on the topic in 1963, and in the 1990s you had Charles Murray and Richard Herrnstein publishing The Bell Curve, and they wrote on page 275, quote, "Whenever the subject of group differences comes up, one of the questions sure to be asked is, Are Jews really smarter than everyone else? End quote. And they noted that on the Armed Forces qualification test that Jews scored an equivalent IQ of 112 versus 100 for white Gentiles. Others who note high Jewish IQ would be Kevin MacDonald, Hans Eisneck. In 1995 he wrote, as far as Jews are concerned, there is no question that they score very highly on IQ tests. Michael Levin in 1997 wrote, in every society in which they have participated, Jews have eventually been recognised and disliked for their exceptional talent. Even though the data of high Jewish IQ and the correlation between IQ and academic and socio-economic success is robust, most historians, social scientists, economists, and even some psychologists ignore the role that intelligence plays in Jewish achievement. And there are many reasons why they might do that. Well, they don't like the idea that intelligence is heritable anyway. But in the medieval period, Jews did not really make substantial contributions to civilization beyond supplying capital for building cathedrals and other ventures. And the achievement quotient is a way to sort of measure achievement between different groups. And that's a ratio between the number of gifted Jews per percent of the population and the number of gifted Gentiles per percent of the population. So if 2% of Jews were gifted compared to 1% of Gentiles, then the Jewish achievement quotient would be 2. Ralph Patai found the high AQ for Jews in medieval Europe, but Charles Murray disputed that. He wrote in his book, Human Accomplishment, The Pursuit of Excellence in the Arts and Sciences, 800 BC to 1950, quite a monumental work. He said he didn't believe it, and he finds that Patai's 626 examples of Jewish innovation were pretty unimportant. But there's more than one important finding. Most Jews in medieval Europe were literate, whereas most Gentiles were not. Therefore, of the people who wrote books, a disproportionate number of them were Jewish per capita, because they were the literate ones, but most of them were translations and commentary on Arabic and Greek texts, so not a lot of it was really groundbreaking. When you sort of think back, you can't really think of groundbreaking Jews in art, science, literature, or anything other than really Spinoza. Colin Berry, in 1999, carried out a study of Jewish achievement, and he concluded that out of 1,352 eminent people, 220 were Jewish. Between 1830 and 1879, they had an AQ of 8.7 and 16.6 for the period between 1880 and 1930. So it basically doubled over that period. And in Charles Murray's Human Achievement, he looks at eminent people between 800 AD and 2000. And he broke it down by country, race, religion, and sex. Between 1830 and 1910, they had an AQ of 6.9 in music, art, science, philosophy, and literature. So his figures turned out to be pretty close to Berry's, and since he was unaware of Berry's work, you could consider them independent results, and that are pretty concordant. Between 1901 and 1950, they have an AQ of 6 for Nobel Prizes in Science and Literature, and between 1951 and 2000, they have an AQ of 12. So to sum up, Jewish achievement is recent, and it went up over the last 2 centuries, especially since the second half of the 19th century, when restrictions on university, music academies, and art colleges were lifted. So if you break it down by different fields of human achievement, that is astronomy, biology, chemistry, earth sciences, economics, engineering, mathematics, medicine, music, literature, painting, philosophy, and physics, Jews do better on average than Gentiles in all fields. But it's in the fields of mathematics, philosophy, physics, and economics that the AQ gap is higher. And the AQ gap is still higher but less wide for engineering, astronomy, painting, and literature. And this matches the findings on the Jewish IQ profile, which finds they have higher verbal, mathematical, and logical IQ and lower visual spatial IQ. It needs to be remembered they still have a higher visual spatial IQ than Gentiles, but it's skewed towards the other categories I mentioned. Despite the overwhelming evidence, most theories don't push Jewish achievements down to intelligence. I mentioned this before. Many people they look at this obviously successful group and they try to explain it. Most people don't explain it in terms of intelligence. And I think a lot of people don't really like that idea that there are a group of people that's just more intelligent. They follow a more blank slate sort of ideology. So the main theories that people come up with is the strong motivation theory, which states that the Jewish religion itself fosters a strong work ethic similar to the Protestant work ethic that was noted by Max Weber. And a study in America by Gerhard Lenski in 1963 said that Jews are like white Protestants and that they're possessed of a, quote, individualistic, competitive patterns of thought and action linked with the middle class and historically associated with the Protestant ethic or its secular counterpart, the spirit of capitalism. And he contrasted this with Catholics and blacks, who he said have, quote, the collectivist, security-orientated, working-class patterns of action historically opposed to the Protestant ethic. Another explanation that is along a similar lines is that socialization for study and educational achievement is the reason why they achieve at a higher rate. And you also find people saying that for East Asian success, Japanese, Koreans, Chinese, the tiger mum concept. Gary Becker, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, wrote in 1981, quote, the high achievement and low fertility of Jewish families are explained by high marginal rates of return to investments in the health, education and other human capital of their children that lower the price of quality relative to quantity. In other words, they have less children and they invest more resources in ensuring that they have good healthcare and education. The family and ethnic networks theory states that due to discrimination, they survived because of ethnic solidarity and mutual aid networks. Another theory is the marginal man theory, and that was developed by Thorstein Veblen, who I mentioned before, and he states that the partial liberation of Jews from traditional Judaism yields a skeptical temper. The combination of withdrawal from Jewish tradition and only partial assimilation into Gentile society endows the intellectual Jew with the virtue of detachment. Skeptical, estranged, alienated, the liberated Jew was ideally suited for a career in science and scholarship. This marginal man, this wanderer in the intellectual no man's land, could see unmediated facts that were less readily observed by minds still clouded by Judaism, Christianity, local customs, tribal idols, or other pre-modern forms of reference. That's a quote that's just there. And the thing is, that theory doesn't really explain why Jews would be good at everything, not just science. Obviously you need skepticism and detachment for science, but Jews exceed in other fields as well that don't really require it. Like chess, for instance. They ceased to be marginal in the second half of the 20th century. So, it doesn't really explain that. And in fact, they seem to do better in the places where they're least marginal, like the US and Britain. So that would be another strike against that theory. The special aptitude theory is, it states that they possess things like higher creativity, more imagination. There are a lot of people who come up with something broadly like that. Daniel Moynihan and Nathan Glasner said that skill in financial and business management served them throughout their history, and that financial and business skill, well, when you think about it, financial and business skill is a product of intelligence. It's not really something independent of it. So that explanation also fails to account, for for success in things like chess. William D. Rubenstein in 2004 said, quote, "Great ability at chess," he tried to explain it, "great ability at chess appears to be an innate gift of some kind. There is universal agreement among experts that by constant practice, study and lessons with outstanding players, someone can improve, but that it is impossible to improve dramatically if the inherent ability is lacking, just as it is impossible for a tennis player to improve enough by practice to compete in the finals at Wimbledon, unless he or she possesses the innate tennis ability of a great player. It may therefore be that Jews are genetically good at chess." Well, yes, but there's no gene for chess, but there are genes that code for intelligence, and being good at chess is a product of high intelligence. You could say that intelligence is a necessary but not sufficient condition for being a highly ranked player in chess. Luck, that's another explanation. It's not a particularly convincing one. A. Godley said that Jews had high socioeconomic success because they went into the fabric and garment industries when they underwent a boom in the late 19th century. Not a particularly good explanation, in my opinion. Doesn't account for their success in a variety of other fields. Some theorists just basically throw all of the above together. Paul Bernstein wrote in 2007, quote, "Getting more education and working long hours, faith that emphasises pursuits in this world as opposed to the afterlife, mutual assistance through self-help organisations that they long maintained in the diaspora, marginality that made them sceptical of conventional ideas, and stimulated creativity led to intellectual eminence and often economic success and social capital and the ability to secure benefits through membership in networks and other social structures." The Irish economist Cormac O'Grada, in 2006, he said that their success is due to bourgeois virtues such as sobriety, the desire to succeed, a dislike of violence, and an emphasis on learning. These explanations have the same flaws of the others. They fail to recognise that general intelligence is a necessary component of all of the traits that they bring up, and that they correlate with IQ, and they fail to account for the variety of success in other intellectual pursuits like chess and bridge. So I guess you have to ask the question, why do they possess high IQs? The average IQ for Ashkenazi Jews has been calculated at 110 versus 100 for Western European Gentiles. This means that 4 times the number of people with IQs at 130 or above, and 6 times the percentage of individuals with IQs of 145 or above. Sephardim, who are the Jews from Spain and Portugal, who mostly migrated to the Balkans, they have an average IQ of 98, and the average IQ in the Balkans for Gentiles is 92. So they're a bit smarter, but nothing to write home about. Definitely nothing to write home about compared to Western European Gentiles. Mizrahi Jews from the Middle East, they have an average IQ of 91 versus 84 for Arabs. And the Ethiopian Jews, as I mentioned before, they have an average IQ of 68, which is the same as other Ethiopian Negroids. So they have, with the exception of the Ethiopians, they have higher IQs than the host populations, and they all do better on measures of educational achievement, earnings, and intellectual achievements. But the high intellectual achievements, like the real high stuff like Nobel Prizes, Fields Medals, and things like that, they're all Ashkenazi because they've got the highest out of all of the above. And there have been 2 Sephardic winners of the Nobel Prize. There was the Bulgarian Elias Canetti for literature in 1981, and the English author Harold Pinter for literature in 2005. But there's no Sephardic chess grandmasters. None of the giants of industry or finance have been Sephardim, with the exception, you'd have to go back a bit, but Moses Maimonides, who you mentioned before, he was actually Sephardic. Spinoza, the philosopher, David Ricardo, the economist, Benjamin Disraeli, the British Prime Minister who converted to Christianity. There aren't many notable Mizrahi. There were some in the sort of medieval Baghdad. There were some mathematicians and scholars writing on algebra and astronomy. In more modern history, Siegfried Sassoon, a World War I era poet, and Charles and Maurice Saatchi, the British advertising tycoons of Saatchi and Saatchi that you might have heard of. Most people who study Jewish success don't consider genetics. In fact, they don't even like the suggestion that it's genetics. They think it's disreputable to even suggest it. Paul Bernstein in 2007 wrote, quote, "There are three major reputable social scientific explanations of why Jews do so well. I emphasize reputable and social scientific to exclude genetic explanations." So he doesn't like genes. Christopher Jenks noted higher Jewish IQs in the 1960s, but he didn't consider genetics. And Arthur Jensen wrote a response to Jenks, and he said, quote, "The fact that very few people might suggest a genetic factor in the Jewish versus non-Jewish IQ difference, which averages about 8 to 10 IQ points, does not make it an unreasonable hypothesis that genetic factors are involved in this subpopulation difference." End quote. And the proponents of the sociological explanations for the Jewish-Gentile IQ gap, they can't explain, well, really a lot of things. They can't explain why identical twins raised apart have highly convergent IQs. They can't explain why Israel, which has all four Jewish subgroups sharing the same environment, so they go to the same schools, got the same educational facilities, same access to healthcare, yet they have divergent IQs and life outcomes. In fact, the Ethiopian Jews, who were not genetically related to the other three categories, the Israeli government said, yeah, you're proper Jews, you can migrate to Israel if you want. And most of them ended up doing that. And they commit a lot of crime. They have high rates of welfare use. They have out-of-wedlock births higher than any other group of people there. And they behave sort of like Negroids behave in everywhere else. And the predominant theory from Israeli sociologists and pretty much most Israeli society at large is that discrimination made them do it. And when they originally noticed that they weren't doing as well, they thought, well, it's discrimination. We'll just give it some time and everything will sort itself out. But that hasn't happened. Miles Sorfer, he claimed that it was better infant care and stimulation during childhood. You might sort of notice that these explanations, well, one, they're used a lot for the success of East Asians. They're also used to explain of why white people score higher on IQ and higher in socioeconomic and attainment than blacks. They use the same arguments. Jews do actually have lower infant mortality rates, but there's no evidence that IQ is caused by, there's no child rearing practice that can really narrow down to raise IQ other than breastfeeding, I guess, which is really just normal. I mean, if the kid's environment is good enough, they're going to have a normal IQ. If you lock them in a cage and starve them, of course they're going to have a deficient IQ, but it just has to be good enough. Kind of like if you're starved of vitamins, you'll have stunted growth, but extra vitamins won't make you grow taller. There's also a 0.2 correlation between myopia, which is short-sightedness, and intelligence. And this is something I find, really fascinating. Myopia is a largely genetic condition, and myopia is more prevalent in East Asians, then whites, then least of all in blacks. And Ashkenazi Jews have high rates of myopia. One study in 1927 found a rate of 13.3 for Jews and 2.3 for Gentiles in London schoolboys. And that's just another thing. I mean, you could use the same argument for a genetic explanation for the white-black difference. It's something that environmentalists can't explain with upbringing and nutrition, especially if supposedly better nutrition would give you better eyesight, yet the more intelligent people who supposedly have all these advantages have worse eyesight. The eugenic hypothesis states that Ashkenazim have practiced eugenics. That is, they conducted practices that promoted a greater survival of the more intelligent offspring and less survival of the less intelligent offspring. And that could happen by either the more intelligent having more children or the intelligent children having better chances at survival into adulthood. Kevin MacDonald makes that case that Judaism has a long tradition that afforded high status to scholars and wealth, and that scholars and the wealthy married their own daughters to other scholars. Also, in many parts of Europe, marriages between Gentiles and Jews were restricted to a certain number per year. Another factor is the Christian church required clergy to be celibate, when monks were really the only literate and scholarly class, so that was a bit of a blunder, that policy. Whereas Jewish rabbis were encouraged to marry young and have families. Whatever the cause of the eugenic effect, it would only have to be small to raise the IQ from the Arab average of 84 to 110 over 2,000 years, because that's only 1.25 points per century, or 0.3 points per generation. So the benefit of the eugenic explanation is that it's consistent with the higher Jewish verbal IQ compared to visual spatial, as the rabbis would need a higher verbal IQ to master the religious texts. And one drawback is it does fail to account for why the increase was greatest amongst Ashkenazi rather than Sephardic or Mizrahi. Now, it could just be that they practiced those eugenic processes more than the other groups, or that they lived in places that were more or less hospitable to the practice. Another hypothesis is the persecution hypothesis, and that states that over 2,000 years of persecution, the stupid ones got killed, and the ones that foresaw danger and made adjustments survived. So it's related to the previous one. It's certainly true that Jews have been persecuted, but empirically demonstrating that the smarter ones survived has been difficult. Bernard Weinrib in the 1970s found that when the Cossacks attacked Jews in Russia, it was the richer ones who fled or were able to pay a ransom, and the poorest ones were killed. So it's reasonable to assume that the richer Jews are on average are the smarter ones. Blom, Fuchs, Mansfeld and Schoffer in 1996 note that during the Nazi occupation of the Netherlands, most of the 25,000 Jews who escaped deportation to concentration camps were middle class. Also, countries that they tried to flee to tended to take educated professionals. One advantage of the persecution hypothesis is that it's consistent with historical data that Ashkenazi were persecuted more than Sephardim and Mizrahi. Mizrahi were tolerated reasonably well under Ottoman and Arab rule, with some exceptions. I mean, it wasn't totally smooth sailing, but generally it's considered that they were more tolerated there than in Europe. The discrimination hypothesis is another one, and it says that Gentiles in Europe restricted the types of occupations Jews could pursue, and this is a view favoured by Harpending and Cochrane. From the 13th century, Jews were forbidden entry into trade guilds, and these guilds monopolised the industry, and they were forbidden to farm. So that left them with the equivalent of what we would call white-collar jobs. Christians were forbidden by the church to lend money with interest, so money lending was a niche Jews could occupy. And survival as a money lender or a merchant or tax farmer would have required verbal and mathematical ability, which is consistent with their IQ profile. It's also consistent in that Jews had more discrimination of occupation to white-collar jobs in Europe than they did in the Middle East. Although there were many prominent Jewish court physicians and scholars in the Islamic world, there are also many who took dirty jobs that the Muslims look down upon, like butchers, tanning, cleaning cesspools, and drying the contents of fuel. And these jobs would be said to have less IQ elasticity, meaning that a high IQ tanner or a high IQ butcher is not really going to do that much better than the average IQ tanner or butcher compared to a high IQ moneylender, compared to an average moneylender. Higher elasticity. The miscegenation hypothesis states that the difference in IQ between Ashkenazi, Sephardic and Mizrahi is due to intermarriage rates with Gentiles. If we take Jews beginning with an IQ of 84, which is the average of the population in the Middle East, then intermarriage with European Gentiles would bring it up to about 90. But that leaves out 20 IQ points, which has to be explained through some other method. But it could be possible that 1/5 of that 84 to 110 jump could be explained by intermarriage. It could explain the differences in IQs between different Jewish populations. There have been more interbreeding between Mizrahi and Middle Easterners, and there is some evidence for this in that Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews have lower rates of genetic disorders affecting Ashkenazim and higher rates of genetic disorders. They have the same high rates of genetic disorders that affect Near East populations, like sickle cell. Interbreeding with Near Easterners would not really raise your IQ that much because the local stock is not very high IQ. So Sephardic Jews fled to the Balkans, and the average IQ in the Balkans is 92. And the Middle Eastern population's 84. So, not really good stock to raise your IQ with. The apostasy hypothesis is the explanation favoured by Charles Murray, and the idea behind it is that Jews early on developed universal male literacy since about 64 AD, and Jewish education involved a lot of intense study of difficult religious texts. And that difficulty would have screened out lower IQ Jews. So the lower IQ Jews who can't really handle the material, they're more likely to renounce their faith and convert to something else. And the genetic hypothesis, what has yet to be explained is what actual genetic thing happened. If the intelligence increased for this group, then it must have occurred either through an accumulation of higher frequency or a higher frequency of genes that code for high intelligence, or mutations developed in that population. The processes that I've talked about, persecution, eugenics, etc., they would be the selection pressures for a high frequency of high IQ genes. But for mutations, Cochrane, Hardy and Harpending have advanced the theory that genetic disorders that are common in Ashkenazim, such as Tay-Sachs, Gaucher, Niemann-Pick, and mucolipidosis type 4, they increase intelligence in heterozygotes, that is, people who have one copy of those genes. And there was a study on 302 Gaucher patients in Israel, which is about the entire number of Gaucher patients in that country. And of the 255 that were working, 15% of them were in high IQ occupations like engineer or scientist. And about 2.25% of the Ashkenazi in Israel are scientists or engineers, so there was about a 20 times overrepresentation of Gaucher patients. So I think I'll wrap it up there. That's what I've got on genetics. Any comments on that?
I do find it kind of fascinating. I did wind back quite a bit through your talk, how like you mentioned, there was such a big emphasis on how do Jews, how have these Jews succeeded so much, and there's like no discussion on genetics.
Yeah, because first of all, it's the genetic hypothesis. It's kind of mainstream in psychology, but it isn't. Sociologists don't like it, especially how they tend to be lefties. I think there's another reason behind it. If you were to say, okay, take blacks. or Aborigines or any underperforming group in white society, the reason given, the official reason given of why they don't succeed is because of discrimination. Now, if Jews who were discriminated against very heavily were able to, in the space of a couple of generations, surpass the achievements of their host populations, that would lay that theory entirely. I mean, it would stand in stark contrast to that explanation. So I think that may be a reason why they don't like that explanation.
Yeah, I guess to a degree, but it's just, and this is something I've noticed, like myself, that there, you can find studies which will be like, okay, here is the difference between like European genetics and African genetics, and like, okay, here, like the Moa gene is a fantastic example. But you don't really get the same with like the difference between Europeans and Jews. It might just be a function of how small their population is, but even so, like there's no the Moa example. There is actually no explicit difference there, but there's no like Ashkenazi data set.
You want to find those genes that led to that. Yeah. Well, I think we all would like to know that. There's only been a few genes that have been identified as correlating with intelligence and brain size, and they tend to have in themselves small effects. So it's actually, that needle in a haystack problem.
Actually, there was a paper published just recently that found 50 of them in one.
That's a good few needles.
Yeah, there's lots of them, but like you said, they all just do this, like it's polygenic, like it's lots and lots and lots of them. Like if you've got like 3 out of the, if you've got the correct allele for 3 of them, then you'll be like maybe a point higher. There's a lot of granularity there, and it would be interesting if we could find something that was just like, this is a particular allele for this is a particular allele that is in high portion of Jews have them, and even inside that subset, the higher IQ Jews have that particular allele, and like let's now look at the distribution of that gene and its alleles in Europeans, in Africans, and in Asians. That's something I would actually really like to see to do, and we don't even do it with, I guess we don't even do it with Asians as well. So I guess it's not really a function of population size. I guess it's more of just a function of people not wanting to talk about IQ and genetics. But yeah,
that's true. Yeah.
Kathy, did you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, this is just something I was thinking about when you were in general kind of talking about the causes of the high IQ. I mean, clearly there's a genetic aspect to it, whether it is through accumulation of high intelligence variants or mutations, or maybe a mixture of the both. But just looking at the kind of, in general, the Ashkenazi genetics, it's important to kind of bear in mind that this high IQ comes at an expense of all these genetic diseases and all these anything from Tay-Sachs to increased risk of breast cancer, all sorts. So I think it's important to understand that IQ isn't the end all and be all of this. And again, you could probably relate their increased neuroticism and increased, I think, a tendency to various sexual perversions, maybe to that as well. I don't know, but it'd be interesting to kind of see how much of that high IQ is then how much of that is cancelled out by the increased kind of genetic disease burden and other mental health burden that they also have.
Well, there's no such thing as a free lunch.
Yeah, and
benefits are normally paid for in some way. Yeah. I mean, what you were talking about with the diseases, well, that is actually one of the possible explanations that I mentioned at the end. That being heterozygote for some of those disorders raises the IQ just as being a heterozygote for sickle cell is protective in African and Middle Eastern populations against malaria. So that's why it's proliferated in that population. Even though you would sort of think of it, why would you genetically? Why would the malaria? Why would the sickle cell gene survive in the population? Well, that's why it does.
Kathy, so you mentioned like we need to understand I agree it's important that we don't want to become Jews.
Well, 5PT.
That wasn't my point.
Do we? Yeah, okay. That's a different discussion.
Okay, we don't want to become Jews, but I think that if we can work out what causes intelligence, like, okay, so we've got this allele, and it's the difference, like, there's an IQ difference, there's an IQ difference in the distribution of them and all that sort of stuff, and we sort of build up a way of looking at it. Okay, so this allele does this different to this other allele, and it has this effect on intelligence, and we can start, and maybe even some other psychological stuff, and then we can start to build up a better understanding of ourselves, because we know, because then we start to learn that if the expression of, say, dopamine is slightly different in this way, then it has this set of effects, and in these set of contexts, this is how it's different, and it's just sort of building up this better understanding of everything. And in order to do that, we need different populations. And so it's kind of like if, Jews are a good example of something that would, of one to analyze, because relatively they're actually, quite, they're inside their own population group, they're actually quite ethnically homogenous compared to the rest of Europe. So, that's really useful for us to have. So that was kind of what I was getting at.
Yeah, and we'd certainly like to find out those genes so that later on down the line, when genetic engineering or any other sort of eugenic practice is feasible along those lines, then you definitely want to know what the genes are.
Yeah, and if you can say, like, okay, so here's your child, and this is the sort of, obviously environment's going to be a part of phenotype, but like this is the sort of spread of possible phenotypes of your child. This is their upper limit, this is their lower limit. I don't think that you should necessarily be making do you abort the child or not sort of decisions on that basis. But like you said, there can be, in the future, like things like gene therapy. It's like, oh, your child has is likely to have like some sort of degenerative disorder in later life, but we can change that with like with fairly simple gene therapy. That sort of thing is the sort of future that we're looking at being able to do with that we're actually looking at being able to just do, and it's kind of incredible. Not too long ago, like a lot of these things you just had, and occasionally they'll pop up in later life, but nowadays we can actually start to affect, and it's it's kind of like, I guess we're discovering like this, but we're discovering fire all over again. It's kind of like where we are with the realms of possibilities for invention now, and it's a fascinating point to be alive.
Yeah, I mean, that Chinese geneticist who was doing research into the genes of intelligence, he said, well, once you figure out what those genes are, then you'll be able to basically predict IQ based on the genome.
Yeah, and
he thought that in the future we'll be able to do that.
I think in the future that we will. There will be, like I said, it won't just be your child is going to be 117 IQ. It'll be your child.
It would be a bit of a... Imagine the doctor, oh, sorry, he's going to be a dummy.
Oh, yeah, sorry, I forgot to carry the one over here. Yeah, your child's retarded. It's just... But no, it's not going to be like that sort of specificity, because there is an environmental component to this. But it will be like, oh yeah, your child will likely be above average IQ. Your child will likely be 105 to 125. And as we get more and more as we get more and more better at it, we'll be able to give more and more precise predictions, and that's still really cool. Like, it's not even from a utilitarian perspective, just like the fact that we're able to do that.
Yeah, it is.
I remember in a similar topic, I think it was Korea, like South Korea, a couple of years back, or it might have been Singapore actually. It was some high functioning East Asian country, but what they did was they got I'm pretty sure it was actually Singapore because it was gum. They got like rubbish that they'd found, like gum that they'd found, that was littered on the floor. And what they did was they actually got the government, or the local government, whoever did it, got the genome analyzed and like a printout of what the perpetrator probably looked like.
Yeah, that is really fascinating.
And they put it up as like advertising, don't chew gum, blah blah blah. But that's like the fact that they can.
Are you talking about like computer generated images of people's face based on their DNA?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really awesome. Yeah.
It's just such a. It's.
Yeah, I mean, you commit a crime. Here's what the dude looks like. No more of those really shitty sketches that the police do.
Well, the best part about it is you could combine them because DNA isn't going to be able to see a facial scar, but you will be able to sort of combine those two things together, and then because I believe like the major problem with like the police sketches is essentially the person reporting on it will focus on only a few details, and their mind basically makes up everything else.
Yeah, that's
So
true.
if you can get those like stark details, which are going to be things like facial scars and all that sort of stuff, or like facial hair and et cetera, then you can use that and build then so you basically get the genetic profile of the face, and then you sort of tweak it. You would just sort of tweak it to whatever additional information that you could get from a witness. Like that's just one thing that you could do. Like there's so much stuff. It's like I said, it's an amazing point that we're alive, and it's just cool.
Yeah, it is.
Anyway, did either of you have any further thoughts, or should we wrap up?
Let's wrap up. I think we can leave more discussion to the following show, hopefully.
Yes, and speaking of, you should definitely join us for our 51st episode, because we will have a very special guest.
Yeah, we're not telling you who it is, though.
Anyway, this has been the Darwin Digest, episode 50, where we've been discussing Jews. Join us next week when we continue our discussion with a very special guest. See you next week.